Hey guys, so with the new role system that was added into the game with tanks, bruisers, ranged assassins, melee assassins, healers, and supports, I figured it was time to do another little series to cover each of the different roles. So in this one, we are going to be talking about tanks and covering everything you need to know about the tank role. Currently, I am sitting at 81% win rates with tanks this season in Storm League. The majority of this is solo queue, but a decent chunk of it is with a couple friends of mine. And we are just stomping by a 90% win rate with a NotParadox, 100% with Blaze, ETC's at a 66%. Pretty solid, straightforward, and I'm going to teach you guys the main tools or the main things to look out for that every tank needs to know. And let's get started. Body blocking is something that is extremely important for tanks. It's important for everyone who's going to be in the front line, but tanks tend to have the largest unit radius, which is essentially this green circle that's around you. The enemy's red circle can't pass it at all, so if you simply just push the enemies into a position where they have to run around you, you can pretty much just stop them from going anywhere, because whichever direction they choose to go, you could just pick a different direction to move around so they can't get around you. So when you're in a tight corner like that, that's really the best way that you want to handle the body blocking, is simply walking in front of them. But if you're ever in a situation where, let's say, the enemies are on this side of you and they're trying to get to this side of you, you will want to approach it in a different direction, where you will kind of move upward as they move upward, and when they change directions to downward, you move downward, as it's impossible to stay in front of people forever. However, you can kind of stay at an angle to where it's hard for them to get around you. In cases like this, don't forget that people like ETC can slide through. People like Diablo can just simply, now if you see, I kind of go up to the side with him, but that's essentially what you want to be doing when you're body blocking people, and it's a very important tactic for taking people out. You'll see it several times in this video. A major thing you want to know as tank is that you apply the pressure enough to where you control where the battlefield is. If you're pushing forward with your team, you're also setting up a battlefield in that area. And you should always be cautious about the battlefield that you create, because it could lead to your own death. And it could be a very, very good thing to apply pressure and create a battlefield into the enemy side, or it could be a really bad thing. Say you're playing with someone like a Li Ming, you want to make sure the battlefield is closer to the enemy's towers so you could be applying a ton of siege damage. But if you're playing someone like a Garrosh, you're going to want the battlefield closer to your turrets so that you can be throwing people over. Based off of how you want to play out the game really changes how you're going to be approaching the role of tanking in the early game and where you want the battle to be. Sometimes you need to take a lot of damage to push the battlefield forward so you can start dealing out some siege damage before an objective. A quick tip when you're playing against some of the more punishing tanks like Garrosh or Diablo, who can pull one person really far away from their team, is to step in front of your team before these people walk up, so that the only person that they can throw is someone like an NotParadox who can take the burst, as well as someone who can survive the throw and end up surviving and escaping. So if you are playing against a Garrosh or a Diablo, try to play tanks who have an engage or an escape that you can get out of these things. Tanks like Arthas can be really challenging against a Garrosh, because you can just throw Arthas and almost always get a kill. But as in a NotParadox or an ETC or a Muradin, you can almost always get away from a Garrosh, making it to where your team can step up against Garrosh without worry, because you're always there to take the shot. But try not to chase them too far into the enemies, as you might end up pretty close into the enemy turrets. Make sure that your escape's always available whenever you walk up, and you'll likely lead to a couple kills. And this goes for a lot of other abilities. If there's abilities that you can block playing a tank and you have enough health, it's oftentimes just best to do that, as you usually have the most self-healing mechanics in the game playing main tanks. In the early game, one of the major things that you want to be looking out for is avoiding making mistakes. And a lot of these mistakes when you're playing a tank are things like, don't charge too far away from your team. I see too many times where people will charge into the enemy team to get a nice stun and a knockback, and then their team's nowhere near them because they just charged away from their team towards the enemy team and they die. The next common mistake that I see is that people will use their escape to engage, and they won't have their escape anymore afterwards. I also see a lot of people that are wasting abilities. If you can see right now, I'm not using my Q very often. I'm simply using my heal, and I'm using my knockback to save my team whenever they make mistakes. As well as you shouldn't be taking any unnecessary damage. For someone like ETC, you're pretty safe to take some hits from a Zagara because you can heal it back. When you're playing as someone who doesn't have as much sustain, you're going to really want to abuse the bushes a little bit more. Like you can see, I'm removing the vision from the bush, and then I'm hiding in the bush so that I can avoid taking unnecessary damage if I can. Especially when going against someone like a Zul Jin, who can stack off of your tank, you want to try to avoid damage. But at the same time, you still want to take the CCs for your team. Assuming you're not making any mistakes, you're going to start noticing the fights are going pretty well for you, usually, as you can simply just knock people away. You can also punish mistakes. So as you can see in this particular situation, the enemy Zul Jin stepped up just enough that I can hit him with a couple abilities, and now I'm just going back in, stopping the enemies, and doing whatever I can. I didn't engage this entire time, and I waited to engage until the Zul Jin stepped up just a little too much. So it can show you how just one little mistake like that can be punished so easily when you're playing a tank and you're holding back your abilities. So don't waste your abilities on every hero that you see. Wait until the enemies make a major mistake, and then you can go in from there. While one of the mistakes that I showed earlier was a target that was really low health, another mistake that enemies do is if they enter a fight alone or just simply out of position. What out of position means is that they will be usually in a place that's too far away from their towers, and you have the tools to kill them before they reach their area. In this case, we can see Zarumag, the Zagara player, was simply out of position. Covering for your allies' mistakes is also a really important piece of playing a tank, especially in low ranks. In this case, we can see that the enemies are coming down to cut off myself and Lily, and it's very easy to simply just knock them away, slide through them, giving both myself and Lily a way to get out of these fights. Then Lily's staying out in front when we should be hiding behind, and it's a very easy hook target for the Stitches. In this case, I walk up, use a W, and I walk away, allowing Lily to get out of this fight, and I have the higher health so I can survive. Simply using these things to save your team from mistakes, even if they're small mistakes, can really add up to you winning a lot more than you're losing. If the enemy's tank is always running away whenever their team makes mistakes, you're naturally going to get more kills and win more often. And it's the same thing when you're playing a tank on your team, is saving your team from one or two small mistakes here and there could be the difference between the game in the long run. I have an entire video on anchoring, which is another tip that you should be doing on tanks, which is essentially sitting in bushes or areas where you might need to get vision from the enemy team. This is really any area that you expect the enemies to run through. This doesn't mean just get in the nearest bush that's next to you. It's more about finding a bush or a vent that you will be expecting the enemies to come through pretty soon. So that is one of the things that you're going to want to do. Again, I have an entire video on anchoring and the benefits of anchoring. But it allows you to see the enemies coming in case you're doing an objective or a boss or anything like that, as well as it allows you guys to maybe even engage on one and get a quick kill. There's a lot of benefits to this. Also, once again, punishing mistakes right there. It's pretty straightforward. That was the Stitches trying to save him from that mistake, but should still lead to a kill. He shouldn't have walked up alone. He shouldn't have been in there in front, and Stitches did his best to handle the other side. Once again, punishing mistakes, just out of position. Whenever people are out of position, that's the only time you see me slide. As you start reaching the mid to late game, you want to start looking for team fights. Team fights are the make it or break it for really any game. If you win the team fights and it leads to you ending the game, these team fights are huge because it's usually a difference between objectives. The first thing you want to look for is what tools do you have that the enemies don't. For example, Imperius just used an 80-second cooldown right there and missed it, which means this is a great time to take a team fight. Not only do we have one ultimate ability on the enemies, but we also have one level on the enemies. So you may see me readjusting my position and maybe getting a little bit closer for a team fight. It's also going to be a 4 versus 4 as we still see two people up top, one from our team and one for the enemy's team. So when you're looking for a team fight, you should always be looking for those few things. What are the health bars on your teams? What are the amount of people you have on your teams? What are the ults that you have available? And what are the talent tiers that are available? I don't really like this fight because I took a lot of damage. They were closer to me. So we readjust the fight here, and then I have Mosh, and I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that I have a Q available and a Mosh available. In this case, my Q and Mosh are available, and I get hit by the Nidus Worm. And right here, we can see that there are 3 people available. If I slide through them and I Mosh, we're going to immediately have 3 people in a mosh. We're going to have at least a Cassia and an Alarak ready for this fight, and we should win this fight. We know that the Bile is already down. I used my peel to keep everyone alive during Bile, as well as I just used knockbacks and used some of the other abilities. We know that Stukov's ult's already down, Zagar's ult's already down, Imperius's ult is already down, and the Zul'jin's ult is already down. We have my ult, we have the ult from the Alarak, as well as the burst damage from the Alarak. This is a winning fight, and all we have to do is mosh at least 2 to 3 people, and we win this fight. So, right as this ends, what do? We take a lot of damage first. I gain my life, and it's perfect slide mosh range. If I slide here, I'm going to be able to mosh 2 people. So I go for this slide. Unfortunately, as I slide through, I'm mashing my mosh button because I want to mosh while they're still stunned. And I didn't realize that Alarak had already pulled them towards them. It doesn't really matter because this mosh is still going to cover the escape for the enemies. And that escape's going to be enough for us to kill off quite a few of their people. And we'll be able to take the objective at this point. I'm going to fast forward through my death as I'm trying to show you the tank roll and not the death roll. On to the next point, you see me start heading up here, and this brings back up the same point from earlier of if the enemies are out of position, you can definitely go for them. But right here, I take a risk by going into their backline and pushing them forward, but I should be focusing more on peeling. I don't want my team to die here. So in this case, I'm just going back and forth, holding the objective and trying to keep my team alive. We kill 2 people, and the Cassia ends up being a little low. The first stun goes to trying to stall out the Imperius. Then I see that the Imperius goes in. He already used his charge. So with a low health Cassia like this, there's a few things that you can do when you're peeling. The first is you can simply walk up and use your abilities, which I go and I use a knockback. The second is when you see her this low and you're against an auto attack hero like Imperius, you can actually step in front of her body, and if you step in front of her body, if the Imperius tries to right click on her, he's actually going to right click on you. So if you see, if I right click anywhere trying to kill this Cassia, I'm going to end up right clicking on the ETC, and I'm also going to be absorbing the attacks from the Imperius's E. Maybe the Cassia gets hit by a few, but my healing over time for guitar solo should be enough to heal her up and take him out. So he wasn't able to take her out, and that is how you win these team fights, is you use your abilities to peel as much as you can. When enemies get out of position, you go for them. You plan out fights that are in winning scenarios, especially like this fight down here. One thing that you notice is that even though my mosh went really poorly and they had a lot of great combos, they were out of all of their abilities when we decided to engage, and they were still down a talent tier. So we still dominated the team fight because it was still a good team fight to take. So if they're bad team fights to take, that's where you try to avoid them and wait for the enemies to make mistakes, and then you take a team fight. You'll likely be winning way more team fights than you will be losing. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this helped you out. And if there's any other tank tips, feel free to throw it down in the comments below. And I will be getting to the other role videos as soon as I can. And also, I still have that psych video, which I plan to get out this week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and feel free to check out my other videos.